Okay, everybody, good morning or good afternoon, I guess as it is. My name is Yvette Subramanian. I'm the Publications and Events Coordinator here at Citrus, and I want to welcome you to today's Research Exchange. We are very fortunate to have Jennifer King, who is a research specialist at the Samuelson Law, Technology, and Public Policy Clinic here at UC Berkeley. She's going to speak to us today on privacy and security implications of RFID. First, I want to, of course, thank Infineon Technologies for sponsoring this research symposium. The sandwiches you're all enjoying are courtesy of Infineon. We wanted to say hello to all our web viewers. As you know, we webcast these to everybody, and people at the other Citrus campuses get together and watch these and enjoy some food as well. We have a few announcements quickly. Today at 2 o'clock over in Bechtel, in 240 Bechtel, there's a talk called Vortex-Induced Vibration for Aquatic Clean Energy. So if you're interested in energy and waves, this is something you might be interested in seeing. On Monday, March 17th at 4 p.m. in this room, we have our next Citrus Distinguished Speaker talk. Severin Borenstein will be here to talk about solar production of energy. And we have ongoing our Big Ideas competition. If you're a student of one of the Citrus campuses and are interested in entering this white paper competition, we have $25,000 in prizes available to the best student proposals. And we had this information on our website as well. So, Jennifer is a social technologist. She draws upon her training in the social sciences and human-computer interaction to investigate the issues that arise when technology and society collide. She's been a researcher here at Berkeley for a few years. Before she came to Berkeley, she worked in security and product management for several internet companies, including Yahoo, where she was an online community expert. She got her master's here in 2006, and she's a UC grad of UC Irvine, so she's been in the system for quite a while. So let's give her a nice big hand.
Hi, everybody. There's a lot more of you, actually, than I was expecting. So I have some handouts, but I only printed up 30, so you may have to share them with your neighbor when I get around to passing those out. So just a quick overview of my talk. I'm going to talk about just what RFID is, talk about the research questions that we're exploring in the context of this inquiry, our actual study and the findings we've had so far, and the implications for ubiquitous computing as well as security. So first, to start off, what is RFID? How many people in here consider themselves fairly familiar with RFID? Okay, more than I would expect well, we're a technical audience in general, so about what I would expect. RFID comes in many different forms and flavors, and what I have up here are some different forms and flavors. In fact, this is the inside of an antenna. This is typically what you'd find in like a credit card, for example. At the very top, that's actually the result of some new research by Hitachi. They have created RFID tags that are basically what they're calling powder or dust size. So that little black speck on that finger is an RFID tag. It's also in the US passport. That's one of the things I'll be talking about today. That's up there, a credit card with a RFID credit card reader. That little ampule is a Verichip. That's designed to be implanted in human tissue. And at the bottom is that little module right there is a speed pass used to pay, I think, at Exxon Mobil gas stations. And actually, I brought some tags with me, which I'll just put on either side if people want to pass them around and just take a look. Just don't take them out of the bag, please, so I end up with them at the end of the presentation. So if you guys could just pass them, around. So just to talk about what terminology I'm using here. By RFID, I mean any technology that transmits specific identifying numbers using radio. And the reason I specify this is that there is a lot of controversy around the term RFID. Some of the folks who are interested in putting RFID in consumer products have really backed away from the term because it's gotten a bad reputation publicly because of some of the privacy concerns. And in some of the papers I've published, I've gotten into arguments with industry folks over whether contactless smart card chips, for example, are considered RFID. So more generically, when you're talking about it, we're referring to anything that has an RF transponder that communicates with radio waves. And as I talk about ubiquitous computing today, I use Weiser's definition here. The idea that you can basically make environments computationally aware. You can embed things like RFID tags into objects like these, into credit cards, into passports, into all sorts of things. And in turn, make objects that currently have no computational ability able to communicate with you and sense things. So some of the evolving uses of RFID, it is actually an old technology in the sense that it's been around since about World War II. And in the past, we've seen it used in livestock management primarily and inventory management. Today, you're seeing it in a lot of things. If you have a UCID, it has an RFID chip in it. That's used to get you into most secured buildings. Library books are more increasingly getting tags. It's definitely used widely in the supply chain. Walmart has been one of the main proponents of getting it into the supply chain to track goods through their system. Government-issued ID, which is one of the things I'll be talking about today. It's shown up in some limited use in consumer products at this point. This object right here is a Nike Plus iPod kit, and you can't really see this. It got washed out. But this piece you put in the bottom of an iPod. This piece you put into your shoe, and it helps you calculate basically your workout time. And when you jog, it will help you calculate your rate. And I don't know if it actually can tell you where you've gone. I don't recall. But it can help you track your workout performance. And car keys. If any of you have a remoter for your car, that operates on RFID. And where we'll see it in the future, there are folks who want to put it into actual clothing, not just maybe as a tag that you can cut out or remove, but actually woven into the fibers of your clothing. There's been one use of putting it in paper clips, assuming that you would use it in your, well, I thought we were all supposed to have paperless offices, but apparently we don't. So in our futuristic, still relying on paper offices, we could have RFID paper clips that tell us where certain piles of things are. There's been talk of putting it into currency. And one of the uses I actually think is really useful is baggage, the idea of using it in temporary baggage tags, so that when you check your baggage in at the airport, there's actually a way of tracking it through the system. And so if it goes missing, ostensibly, there will be a way to find it. So our research, we're working from the premise that RFID is a somewhat new and what I would call disruptive technology. And it has the potential to change how people interact with their environment. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to explore how users think about RFID, if they understand how it works and how they actually expect it to work. And we investigated this approach by looking at some RFID-enabled objects in two different domains. One was the consumer domain of consumer products, and that at this phase it was credit cards. And then in public or government-issued objects, and that was the e-passport and public transit. And just an example of what I mean is disruptive technology. Most of us social technologists would consider mobile phones to be a good example of a disruptive technology. You know, that's something that came into the environment that, for many, the communication appearance is obvious, but they've really had a transformative effect on how people relate to each other, not just interpersonally, but in public spaces. Just imagine how you feel about someone blathering on the cell phone while you're sitting on the bus, for example. And even a step further are something like camera phones. I mean, that's one I personally, when I saw my first camera phone, thought to myself, why do you need this? Like, what is the point? But we've seen that it's really transformed how people interact, not only with each other, but within their environments in very dramatic ways in the past 5 or so years that they've been in existence. So related work. There's actually not a whole lot of related work out here at this point, which is why I was interested in studying this area. There have been a handful of studies, some academic, but a lot of them have been by actual companies, looking into how people perceive the use of RFID in consumer goods. And not surprisingly, a lot of people see some pretty significant privacy issues with it. The biggest being around the fact that if I embed a tag into a product and you take it home with you, most people don't really want that tag to be active after the point of purchase. It's one of those things where the benefits really tend to fall on the side of the company because it makes sense for them in terms of being able to track this item, you know, through their entire supply chain. If you need to make a return of something you bought, you come back, they know you bought this item. Not that I just bought a blue shirt, but that blue shirt. So it allows them to kind of track something the whole way through. But for you, once you take something home, they haven't really demonstrated that there's much benefit for you for having an RFID tag. And the fact, too, is that as they become more pervasive, there's a question of, you know, can people just start querying you as you walk around? And, you know, even if it's just a static ID, it's a unique ID. It's a unique identifier that can be related to you. And so it's definitely raised a lot of privacy concerns, particularly because industry hasn't yet really shown a good way of disabling those tags after the point of purchase. They've experimented with kiosks, for example. You know, the idea that you would take your RFID-enabled basket of, you know, goods that you walk through your RFID-enabled checkout, and then somehow you have to go to a kiosk and kill the individual tags in order to disable them. And as you can imagine, that experience so far has not really gained much following. So that's I think, one of the biggest impediments we've seen so far to why you haven't seen it rolled out on a grand scale yet in consumer goods. But there's a couple of studies, one published, one not. One was at CHI last year. It was put forth by some Nokia folks, and what they did is they basically took RFID-enabled cell phones, and that's something I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. But in that context, it's called near-field communication. It's basically RFID. And what they do is they gave 50 subjects on the streets of Helsinki one of these phones, and they presented 2 posters to them. On one poster, they had a 2D barcode. And the other poster, they had an RFID tag. And it was a poster for a fake rock band. And the idea was that you can learn more about this band by reading this tag or reading the barcode. What they found is that most people with their cell phones could figure out what to do with the 2D barcode. Like, they knew it was something strange. Most of them figured out that if they used the camera function on the cell phone, they could take a picture of it, and then the phone would give them more information back. But the RFID tag, even though they had it visually demarcated on the poster, most people just kind of like went, I don't know. Like, they rubbed the phone on it, they pointed the phone at it, they used the camera function, but most people just couldn't figure out what you were supposed to do with this thing. And so it really was one of the first papers showing that people didn't have a good, what I call mental model, and I'll talk more about that as well, a mental model of how to interact with this technology. They didn't have any other reference for it. There was a paper that's, I think, since been resubmitted to a conference by some colleagues of mine at Georgia Tech, where they used the concept of mental models to explore how people perceive RFID generally. And they had about 35 subjects, and what they did is they basically did semi-structured interviews. And they also basically, they gave people photos and did what they call a photo elicitation exercise, where they have photos and they ask you a context question, like, what do you think of RFID? And they have people sort through photos. Some of those may contain RFID tags. They may contain photos of context in which RFID is used, and so on. And they code the photos, and they have people go through and sort them according to how they feel or how they think about answers to the questions they ask. And through that, they found also that most people were very confused about how RFID worked. And one of the common things they did, and we've seen this in our own work to date, is that people often ascribe more power to it than it actually has. And one of the most common ways they do that is they basically think it's something like satellite technology, and that with an RFID tag, the government can track you via satellites. Now, if you know something about RFID, you know that's not possible. But it's a very real concern that people articulated, that it's somehow going to empower the government to use satellite technology to track everybody everywhere they go. So that's a fundamental, substantial misunderstanding of how the technology works. And I think that where this comes from is probably partially from people thinking it has something to do with GPS technology. But it's also been recommended to me, and I haven't seen this movie yet. It's on my Netflix queue, Enemy of the State, that a lot of people have seen the movie Enemy of the State and watched that kind of futuristic view of the government being able to track people around, and that's one of the references they've used to construct this model of how RFID works. But one of the other things that they found in the study, or at least they didn't find it, but they really brought it to light, was that RFID has no interface. It's not like software, where there's a particular interface that I can configure that you as a user will interact with. RFID doesn't have that. It's invisible. It's, you don't know what's going on. You don't know if someone's reading a tag at any one moment or not. And so it really brings up some interesting issues around notice, choice, and consent. And from these, I draw from the fair information practices. This is basically a framework that the government uses to define systems, or define your rights in systems where information about you is collected. So in an RFID system, if I'm collecting personal information about you from an RFID tag, how do I give you notice that I'm doing that? How do I allow you some degree of choice if I'm doing that or not? And how do you, in turn, consent to that type of thing? It brings up some really complicated legal and social questions. So some of the concerns with RFID, I've already mentioned a few. But primarily, we're talking about privacy threats. And some of those are that often on these tags, the data is static. It doesn't change. And so if you carry something with you with that unique identifier, it can be, if I can read it, I can reference it back to you if I know who you are. User awareness. You may not realize that the object that you've just purchased has an RFID transponder in it. And signaling, as I've referred to a few times already now, the object itself most likely cannot notify you when the data is read. That's especially true with most RFID because it doesn't contain a power source. How many people are Fast Track users? Anybody? Or Easy Pass? Handful of you. So one of the things you'll note when you go through the toll plaza is that that transponder has a light on it, and it beeps, and it lets you know when you've crossed through the toll plaza. It gives you feedback. And plus, there's the visual display as well. Most RFID tags don't have battery power. That's why they're cheap. That's why you can put them in so many things. That's why they're small. They're powered by the radio frequency field. And so in that case, there's no way to know if something's been read. If you have, let's say, an RFID-enabled water bottle, you're reliant on the reader itself giving you feedback. And readers do not have to give you feedback. I have several in my possession. It's a software and a hardware decision if you want to let something beep or flash when you read. So anyway, some of the security issues, tracking and hot listing. Tracking, as I've described, just being able to track you according to a unique ID. Hot listing, building a database of IDs that I can refer back to you. Eavesdropping on communications between tags and readers. Skimming, the idea that I can walk around and skim information off an RFID without you knowing it. And cloning, which is a really important issue when you're talking about government-issued ID in particular. The fact that I might be able to clone the data on your tag if it's not well protected. And in a world where we're looking for stronger forms of identification, if I can clone your ID, that is a significant gain in power. So, and then just the increasing ubiquity. This is a very early stage in the public distribution of RFID. And as you put more and more tags in more and more places, it becomes truly ubiquitous technology, and the opportunities to read it grow. And so in the value as well that holds for people grows as well. So some of the evolving uses. Identification is one area. We've got the US e-passport now has RFID that was released in 2006. There's also been passports around the world that have had it for the last couple of years. The pass card and the enhanced driver's license are two other forms in the US. The enhanced driver's license just came out in January. The pass card is not yet out. I'm going to talk more about those in a little bit. In the US, we've seen it in transit, the Easy Pass, and Fast Track, and also transit cards. Atlanta has one. New York City's been testing one, but I don't know if it's out yet. In the Bay Area, we're supposed to have, the name just escaped me. Does anybody remember the name of the Bay Area one we're supposed to have soon? Yes, thank you, TransLink. TransLink, I think, is supposed to be out next month. But if any of you have been in the Bay Area for a while, you've seen those readers on public transit now for, I think, about 5 years. So it's been a long time in coming. But most transit uses are very widespread in Europe as well as Asia. That's a picture of the octopus cart that's used widely in Asia. And in both Europe and Asia, their transit cards have become more of hybrid cards where you can use them not only for public transit, but you can also use them to pay for things. You can stock them with cash and pay at your local, international version of the 7-Eleven, for example, and use them for convenience purchases. Although that's an out up there for a hybrid Oyster, which is the UK version, Oyster and credit card. So in the UK, they're now integrating credit card uses into these as well. Some of the future uses we'll probably see, as I've mentioned, item or product level tagging at an individual level. Near field communication use in cell phones. That's an example of a Nokia cell phone communicating with a RFID-enabled credit card reader. That one's for MasterCard. And as I also said on the first slide, maybe not a widespread use, but something that's definitely being pushed by the Verichip Corporation is being able to implant RFIDs into human beings. Primarily, they're marketing it right now as a way of allowing you to have instant access to your medical records, for example. And it might be a very valid use for people who have severe health conditions and feel that's an important thing to have with them. If you notice in those bags I've passed around, oh, that stopped. If you don't mind passing that around. At least one of those bags has, okay, great. One of those bags has not Verichips, but some ampules that are very similar to the type that we can implant in human tissue. So some of the current issues with government uses of RFID. Often you have no choice when it comes to whether or not you want a government-issued ID. And so in particular, I've studied the problems with the e-passport and the eventual change it made from its first draft to what we actually have now, which it really substantially improved. But the very first version of it that was put forth basically placed all of the burden of protecting yourself on you as the passport holder. They had no security protections whatsoever. And so what we found when we did an investigation of that process is that there was zero consideration of what the user's needs were in this picture. It was all about the desires and needs of the Department of State and for Homeland Security. And despite there actually being a privacy impact assessment process in place in the federal government, it really didn't work in the case of the e-passport. And luckily, because they had to actually, they decided to do some federal rulemaking where they publicly posted their plans for the passport. There was a lot of public feedback, and that really contributed to them having to go back to the drawing board and rescope the design. There's also a fairly poor understanding on the part of the government right now as to how RFID works and what it really is. I'm actually sitting right now on a panel of experts in California looking at issues of whether or not we should be putting RFIDs into government-issued or California-issued ID documents. And I can tell you firsthand what I'm seeing is that most people, even on my board, don't understand how it works. You know, they, like our users in our study, assume that if you have a reader and a tag, the reader has to beep. Like they just don't fundamentally get it that there are instances where you can read RFID tags and you don't have to give any signaling at all. There's also a lot of misunderstandings around read ranges and such. And so what we're seeing is that there's really a lack of understanding around what they're doing and the type of infrastructure they could potentially be building for the future. So our study, we investigated user mental models of RF technology in general and then RFID specifically. This is exploratory research. We're going to continue working on this year. So our findings right now are very preliminary, just to give you a caveat. We had a small sample to start, 9 subjects, and we, in particular, looked for a certain type of subject. We wanted to find 3 people who knew nothing about RFID or who considered themselves technological novices. We found 3 people who seemed to have an intermediate understanding of technology and 3 people we considered having an expert level in terms of their ability to understand technology. And we looked at 3 different things. We looked at transit cards, credit cards, and the e-passport. And the point was that we really wanted to look at real-world objects that were in people's hands today rather than prototypes of things that they'd never seen before. And so just briefly, mental models. Mental models as a concept put forth by Don Norman. If anybody's ever read The Design of Everyday Things, it's that Don Norman. And what he's trying to do is to bridge the gap between what most of you would imagine are engineers and system designers or product designers or whatever you want to call yourselves. People who actually have expertise in technology and design something versus the people who actually use it. And what he attempts to do is bridge that gap by describing what he calls a mental model, the idea that users have kind of an image in their head of how something works. And what best works is if you can map that user's mental model to whatever it is you're building. I think a good way of thinking about this is if you think about cars. Most of us have a mental model today of how a car works, and it really operates on a spectrum. You may know precisely how a car works. You may understand internal combustion and so forth, or you might have the most minimal understanding of how a car works. But in general, what you want to do is be able to design a car such that even the person with a minimal understanding of how a car works can grasp the basics and actually use this thing necessarily without having an expert's understanding. And so we applied this concept by attempting to elicit how people thought about RFID. And we did this by we tried to triangulate, basically. We gave them a survey, and we tried to get a baseline measure, first of if they knew anything about RFID. We asked them a lot of questions about other radio frequency-enabled objects to see if we could get a sense of if they understood how these things worked. From basically a scale of, I've either never used it, I've never used it before, I have no idea what this thing is. Garage door openers, for example, that's one thing we looked at. To I've seen it before, I think I know how it works, to someone who could describe, yes, I understand, exactly how this thing works. And then we conducted structured interviews with them after they completed the survey, not only to discussing what they told us on the survey, but also then to discuss their use of whatever the object was that we were examining. Again, a credit card, a passport, or a transit card. And as part of that, we actually gave them some of the official documentation that was produced with these objects, so we could give that to them and get a sense of if they had any further understanding after seeing that as to how these things functioned. So most of our subjects had heard of the term RFID, but we did recruit from the Berkeley campus, so that didn't actually surprise me. I think it was probably much higher than we'd find in the real world. But even so, half of them had no understanding of how it worked. They just didn't know. And then we asked them to evaluate some personal usage scenarios. We said, how comfortable are you with using transit passes? Most of them were pretty comfortable with that idea. If you had a keyless entry for your home, how would you feel about that? And we specifically said home and not the office because we wanted to put the context in something more personal. And that we got a very mixed response to. Credit cards, as we'll learn more about, over half of our subjects were really uncomfortable with the idea of using contactless credit cards. We didn't use the term RFID in these questions because we didn't want to bias them. And then the passport. Most of them were very uncomfortable or just very uncertain as to why RFID would even be in the passport and what good it would do them. And so I'm going to go through these three objects in turn. Transit cards. We asked specifically about the BART Easy Rider card. Does anybody have that here? Any BART Easy Rider? Just one? Okay. And then Fast Track actually came up a lot in our conversations. We didn't ask them specifically. We didn't recruit Fast Track users specifically, but almost everybody brought it up because they understood that. So we had a lot of comments on Fast Track. And this was the form factor that people most easily understood. Both the structure of the interaction as well as kind of what they expected out of it. It really conformed to what users really thought should happen. Mostly because there are really some obvious benefits and efficiencies gained by using this. You don't have to scrounge for change at the toll plaza or when you're going to the BART station. It saves you time. The tickets, you don't have to get paper tickets anymore. The benefits really made sense to people. They also saw that there was really little personal risk involved for them because the information tied to these things, they didn't see it as valuable. It was their travel information, and they just thought, it's not going to tell anybody anything that interesting about me. RFID credit cards were a bit different. Subjects really saw little benefit to the fact that the issuers were putting RFID in there. And they really didn't think the efficiency gains worthwhile. And the credit card companies are really trying to counter this idea right now. They actually just released a study in the UK where they were trying to determine the number of hours people waste by using cash versus what you would gain by using an RFID credit card. And they put it in the hundreds of hours per year category. I'm a little suspicious of their methodology and how they conducted this. But in general, what the credit card companies are trying to do here is they're really trying to infringe on the cash market. They want people to get away from cash completely and to just walk through and use these credit cards. Now, does anybody actually have one? One person? Have you used it before?
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah? Okay, you're one of the early adopters. What happens with these cards is that you can use them to make a purchase under $25 without actually signing for the purchase. And what we found is that many of our subjects were really uncomfortable with that idea. They liked the security, and I say security in scare quotes because I don't even know if it makes a difference when you sign for your actual credit card statements, but they really liked the idea of signing, that somehow made it more official to them or less risky. Because this had to do with their financial data, it made them a bit more nervous. And partially that's because of everybody we asked, pretty much nobody had any idea what was stored on their credit cards. People suggested their social security numbers might be on there, their home addresses. None of those things are true. It's your name, it's your credit card number, your expiration date. I'm not sure if there's actually anything else, but I know at least that's there. But definitely not your home address or anything like that. So because they were uncertain, they were just very uncomfortable with the idea, especially many of them mentioned identity theft as being something they thought about. They were, in general, were comfortable with the idea of a single-use card, like the transit cards, than something that could be used for general-purpose payments. Then finally, the e-passport. Now, none of our subjects really saw any benefit to them personally from having an e-passport. And fundamentally, they didn't understand why it was that it needed to be remotely readable. They were concerned about security due to the amount of information, personal information stored in this document. And many of them said things like the stakes seemed a lot higher to them. We had several people who were naturalized citizens and said, this passport proves I'm a U.S. citizen. Without that, someone might think I'm an illegal alien. And therefore, the security of that document is much more of an important issue to me. But it was coupled with this lack of faith that the government was doing anything to look after their own interests. So actually, I want to just pass these out. And then, like I said, there won't be enough, so I apologize for that in advance. But this is the document that you should be getting when you get your U.S. passport. And so this is an example of the type of thing that we gave people. This is actually an official document from the U.S. government. It's not something we wrote up. But it's supposed to come when you get your new passport. And this is the type of thing we gave people and asked them to skim over and ask them afterwards, do you feel like you understand anything more about this thing, about the passport, now that you've read this? Do you feel as if you understand what the security benefits are, what the risks might be to you? And in general, no one had a clue after reading it if they could understand. They didn't even get a sense that there was RFID in it. If you look at the terminology they use, No offense to the engineers in the audience, but it sounds like an engineer wrote it, and it's not the type of thing that you can use to communicate to, let's say, my 85-year-old grandmother, for example. She's not going to get it. Of course, as one critical point here, I wonder, the passport, as I mentioned earlier, as it's been released, is, I'll talk more about the levels of risk in a few more slides, but it is a fairly secure document. There's not really, for the average user, there's not a potential huge amount of risk to you from using this with RFID. And so I do bring up a critical point, which is if the risk is that minimal, should the government be bound to tell you that there is any risk at all? I mean, perhaps I'm being alarmist here. So some of the commonalities in what we found. Everybody generally perceived RFID as something that brought them convenience and efficiency. That was a use that made sense. It was supposed to speed up transactions. It was supposed to make things frictionless. But where is the beep? That was the #1 expectation among all of our users. Everybody universally expected feedback, whether it was audible or visual, when the chip was read. We also found that the context of the type of information we were talking about was really important. Transit passes, low value to our users, made a lot of sense. Passport, very suspicious, thought that the information it had a lot more personal meaning to them, and it made them a lot more uncomfortable. And credit cards kind of fell, I think, in between the two. And so some of the questions this brought up for us is, does the expected use align with the user benefits and with the type of information that it's sharing or exposing? And does the issuer benefit more than the user? I think credit cards are an interesting question to consider here. For some people, they may offer benefits that they think is worth any risk at all. And they don't think the risks of sharing or financial information are probably low, mostly because we know that if someone steals your credit card, you're generally not going to be liable for it. So in that sense, the risk may be low. I do think it's a question whether or not this is really for the issuer's benefit than the user's benefit. And we have at least one person in the audience who will tell you that they find it great, and other people I can know who don't. Uh-oh. Here we go. OK. Again, issues with notice and consent. So none of the subjects were made aware of the presence of the chip, usually by the object's user, or at least in the context of telling you that there was radio frequency technology in your object. People who knew about it were generally made aware from things in the media or from news reports. But if you look at the official documentation, well, I just passed around the passport documentation. They tell you there's an integrated circuit, which, again, if you're an engineer, that is meaningful to you. If you're not, it's not. But with credit cards, for example, there's never any mention of RFID. It's about the great new, fantastic, fun thing that we've sent you and the new experience you get to be a part of. And there's never any risk or never any mention of the fact that it's radio frequency. And after we would show each subject information related to the object that we were studying, generally none of them had any better understanding after they saw it, whether or not how the thing actually worked. And so some of the implications for security. So let me talk about the actual risk of these three objects first. The e-passport uses a weak form of encryption. When you query it, it gives a non-static ID, so it does rotate. And it does contain a foil cover, a Faraday cage, in order to protect it from being read. But it can be read when it's open more than about a 1/4 inch. And if you think about how you use your passport, it is perfectly flat that first day you get it back from the Department of State. But as you use it, I sit there and fiddle with it myself, turn it, put it in my pocket, sit on it, carry it in a bag. Unless you take an actual active, unless you actively try to keep it closed, it does fall open over time. And so in theory, it can be read even with that foil lining. Transit cards use a static ID, but at least with the BART card, I really can't speak for anything else, but I did confirm this with BART. BART does encrypt the data on their cards. And again, they're not storing anything about you as far as I know. It's really just keeping track of your transit information. It's going to deduct it from a master account somewhere else. So in terms of there being any personal information on there, it's low risk with using them. So credit cards are an interesting one. To date, as far as we know, credit card data is not encrypted. There was a study done by some researchers at the University of Massachusetts, Kevin Fu. He spoke here at a trust lecture last year. And they found that the data on the cards is not encrypted. They do issue a static ID. And in general, I believe the limitation for reading them is based on the reader software. So if you get the right reader with the right reader software, you can read them. Now, this is actually not a difficult thing to do. When they conducted their research study, they got their reader off of eBay. Pretty easy. So you can imagine that once these things become more widespread, someone is certainly going to take a reader, reverse engineer the software on it and release the software out to the public. So in general, will that become a way to efficiently steal people's credit card information? The fact that I can then take a reader and walk through a crowded place and just have it randomly query as I walk through and grab people's numbers? Probably not the world's most efficient way of committing credit card theft, but it's still a potential risk, especially since we know they haven't encrypted the data on the credit cards. So one of the points I try to bring through in this is that if you're looking at unprotected implementations, really understanding how to mitigate your risk depends on you understanding how RFID works at all. And this is especially absent clear guidelines, which to date we've found very few clear guidelines. And so if you don't understand that a reader doesn't have to beep, or you don't understand the nuances of how radio frequency works, then you may not understand how to actually mitigate that risk, how to use a shield. The pass card and the enhanced driver's license, which I'll talk more about in a minute, those are actually being given to the public with a shield, so a little envelope that you can slide the card in. But again, if you go to the state of Washington site and you read about this thing, they don't tell you anything about, well, they tell you it's RFID. They do admit that. They tell you nothing about any potential security risks. And they don't explain to you why you would need to use this protective shield. And so most people are likely going to throw them away. They might use them at first. They'll get torn. They won't replace them. And so you are putting something out there where most people don't understand that in order to not broadcast an ID to a wider audience, that you actually need to do something proactive on your part. So some of the implications for ubiquitous computing right now is that, first, people right now just don't get it. And frankly, it worries them. With the lack of understanding, people are more inclined to ascribe kind of paranoia and concern to what it can do. And so how do you introduce this technology to the public in a way that actually makes it transparent isn't really the right word here, but it makes it clear as to how it works and what it's used for. So I guess what I say is, how do you make it observable versus invisible? And this is especially true with implementations that deal with personal data. And notice and consent issues, so how do you manage the practicalities of notice and consent in a ubiquitous computing environment? This is a question that people researchers in this area have really been struggling with for the past couple of years. And also, how do you respect the desire of someone to opt out of this if they don't want to be a part of the wireless future? Some of the implications for government use, and I think this is a really fundamental question, which is, should governments be incorporating this technology into government publicly issued ID at this point? The Department of Homeland Security's own Privacy Advisory Board released this statement in 2006, where they came out actually firmly against it. They just don't think it's appropriate right now, and that the benefits to the users certainly are negligible, and that they think the benefits to the federal government actually are negligible as well, that there are other technologies or other ways to produce things like government-issued ID that take into account what the government needs, such as anti-counterfeiting measures that don't need to be accomplished with RFID. And so just a last couple notes about these two things. Up at top, that's the US passport card. It's called the Pass Card. It's not yet available. That is a lightweight passport that they're offering to residents of states with land border crossings. So as a California resident, you can, actually I think anybody can get one. But let's say that you travel, this happens a lot in Washington state, and actually this is why the state of Washington is releasing the enhanced driver's license. The enhanced driver's license is a combination passport and driver's license. And the idea is that for people who don't want to spend $95 on a passport, this gives you a far cheaper option. I think it's 30 or 40. And if you live in a border state, especially Washington, Canada, there's a lot of people who cross the border on a daily basis for work. They commute. And the idea was that there were a lot of folks who thought that $95 in the state of Washington was too much money to spend on a passport. And so the state responded by issuing this pass card. But what they've done here is they've used high-frequency RFID in this. So it's not a contactless smart card the way the e-passport is or that credit cards use. And contactless smart cards generally have a very low read range. It's a couple centimeters or a couple inches. These actually can be read. This is the same type of RFID you find in Fast Track. So you can read at a distance of about 30 feet. And while it's not going to store any personal information, it will contain a unique static identifier that will not change. And so those of us who are concerned about privacy issues think this is a fairly poor implementation. And actually, even the contactless smart card chip industry has come out against this, mostly because they're not using their technology. But there's been a lot of concern that as more and more of these get in people's hands, I mean, the fact that they can be read from such a far distance is really a concern, and that most people aren't going to understand this. And even though they're giving people sleeves, again, I bring up the same issue before, it puts all the burden on you to protect yourself if you're concerned about this as a risk. And if you don't understand how it works, chances are you're not going to use that sleeve. And it's possible that as these things become more widely distributed, someone realizes there's real value in collecting these IDs. Some people have looked at it from the point of view of saying, well, we think government databases are open to hacking, and so it's possible I can collect IDs and then grab these people's information if I'm able to get into that database. That's one way to look at it. Another is just that you might be able to, maybe not nefarious uses, maybe not hacking, black hat type uses, but there might be concerns with commercial uses, with the fact that today it's illegal for, if you go into a store, for example, for them to scan your driver's license and grab that information and make a copy of it. And it might be that retailers may start grabbing this and using it as yet another way to link you to something you've purchased or something you've bought, and just adds more interesting permutations of how we can track people through society. So that is my presentation, which is good because I think I have 10 minutes, so I'll be happy to take any questions anybody might have, if there are any.
Thanks, Jennifer. Okay, great talk. We have questions from the audience here. All righty.
Thanks. That was interesting. I have two questions. One of them is, was it perhaps the Homeland Security claim, it's hard to predict what they're thinking, that it's harder to duplicate an RFID than it is to duplicate a piece of paper? And the second question I have is that is anybody using technology of read-write RFID tags?
Okay. For the first claim, I'm sure it does set the bar higher. So it might be that the people today who clone IDs using home printers and such, it makes it more difficult, but it certainly doesn't make it impossible. I mean, I think it's a matter of time before. I mean, it does raise the bar, but it just in turn raises the level of sophistication that you'll need in order to actually make fake IDs, and it will catch up. It might make it a smaller market, but it's easy to get your hands on this type on the components for sure. So the second, read-write. I'm not sure I would call contactless smart cards read-write, and this is where my engineering expertise begins to get a little thin, I admit. Contactless smart cards have computational ability, and that's why they're used for financial transactions, because you basically want to have a counter to be able to count transactions. That technically, I believe, is not read-write capability. I mean, you certainly can get read-write RFID, but I don't think in general most places are using them. Okay, so there actually has been one example. This was in Europe. There's a grocery store chain called the Metro Future Store. I don't know if anybody's ever been to the Metro Future Store. They've been testing RFID in consumer products, and they were using read-write tags because they were actually trying to test the concept of what's the word I'm looking for suddenly, of zeroing out the tag or destroying the tag, not destroying. The way they wanted to zero out the tags after point of purchase so that they couldn't be used again was basically they'd take the information, the number in the on the tag, and they just write it over with zeros. And that was their way of killing, sorry, that's the word I was looking for, killing the tag for point of purchase. And actually a great hacker and colleague, Lucas Grunwald, who's I think one of the probably best RFID hackers out there, he actually did an experiment where he went into the Metro Future Store, and they were only tagging two products. Well, I believe they were tagging movies, but they were tagging cream cheese, Philadelphia cream cheese, and Pantene shampoo, and he was able to prove that you could swap the IDs in the store and make the cream cheese show up as the shampoo. And I think they were also doing DVDs, and he was able to like change maybe the tag on the DVDs to cream cheese, so they were much cheaper and check out that way. So, which I think made the manufacturers realize, okay, maybe read-write tags aren't quite our solution for dealing with the consumer with the kill tag issue, which is why I think they've not yet resolved that as an efficient way of killing tags. Long answer. Other questions? Yes. Oh, Okay, sorry.
So in the case of anonymous IDs, high-frequency IDs where it can be read up to 30 feet away, are there legal privacy concerns about collecting that data essentially anonymously so that you could track whether a certain person that you couldn't identify with a person came through a certain area regularly?
Yes, yes, absolutely. Is there a law against that? I don't know if there's a federal driver's license law, and forgive me because I'm not a lawyer, I don't have the exact law memorized, that prohibits you from using the mag stripe in California, or in most states they use a 2D barcode. They prohibit merchants from collecting that information. They can't scan your driver's license. I don't know if that will apply to the Washington State EDL. It probably will. I don't know if that even falls within the purview of the pass card, for example, because it's not considered a driver's license. I think Homeland Security's position, and thus the state of Washington, continues to be, it's a unique ID. In order for it to be meaningful, you'd have to have access to our databases, and because you don't, it doesn't matter. They're really saying, the idea that you can harvest those and use them to link to somebody and track you is just, they're not even willing to consider that as a threat scenario right now. Not to say that it won't be eventually, but their position right now is it's not.
Actually, I have 3 questions from remote people real quick. I'll ask a couple of them
Cool.
here. We have, what prevents a strong encryption like RES from being used in RFID devices? Then only the issuing authority can read the data, and readability by others and range will not be a concern.
Contactless smart cards definitely can use encryption. I don't know, they have limited computational abilities, so at some point I don't know what level of encryption you can use for them to actually still use it efficiently. One of the reasons they didn't want to use it on the passport to begin with was that it was going to slow down the processing time. They really wanted the processing time to be like a half second, and when they introduced the level of encryption they do have now, which is basic access control, I don't know what it is finally. In testing, it was something like 15 seconds for them in order to swipe the passport, because now you actually have to derive the key for the passport from the machine-readable portion. They have to swipe it, it generates the key, it unlocks the passport, but that read time was pretty long. It was like 15 seconds. I think it's because when they first came up with the whole scenario, it was this magic, you just walk through the port of entry and it just reads your RFID passport like that, and there's nothing else you need to do. It's really based on kind of fantasy. But I'd say the other issue with encryption is that you have to manage encryption keys. And so BART, for example, public transit, closed system, makes sense. They can do it. I think that's the reason why you're not seeing it in credit cards, is because you had 3 different primary issuers, and you couldn't necessarily get agreement on what to do there. But with government applications, especially if they need to be interoperable, not just within the federal government, but within all 50 states, if they need to be interoperate internationally, the practicalities of implementing encryption and managing encryption and keys, I think at this point, are fairly insurmountable for big government entities to deal with.
Do one more, and then I'll get back to you guys. From Davis, it says, you mentioned the steep drop-off in benefit to the consumer for keeping tags alive past the point of purchase. Mm-hmm. The application, they messed up. The application that people often mention here is recycling. Do you have any thoughts on this claim?
It was recycling, but was the, for keeping tabs past the point of, recycling. I think, again, it depends on context. If we're talking about printers, if we're talking about objects that you don't take out of the house, that you buy and then they stay at home, that tends to make a lot of sense. Computers, large electronics. It's when it starts getting down to the micro level. But again, if I have RFID tags on my iPod, for example, if it's something that the consumer can choose to disable, I think that's a great solution. If it's embedded into the actual casing itself that someone then can't take the choice to somehow disable or remove in some way, I think it gets problematic. So there are definitely benefits to be gained, and I think there are ways that you can still use them for recycling, maybe on a macro level, but it's when it becomes micro goods that you're carrying on you that I think you have to maybe think about it in the context of what people do with them on a daily basis.
I read somewhere that the Danish are coming out with higher speed. Do you want to ask when we pass the mic up?
Sorry. I'm sorry, organic tag? As in not inorganic. Oh, as in living. I was like, organic as in produce? Wait a second. I don't really have anything to comment on it. I think I've heard about it, but there's certainly a lot of ways you can. I think you can now print them too using. You don't even have to. You can use microprinting to do them. Anyway, sorry. Yeah, I don't know enough about organic tags at this point.
So.
Yeah.
It seems that it's a very easy concept to communicate to people if you just use the visual metaphor. Imagine walking around with big black and white readable numbers on you or on your clothing, and any scanner is just like a camera that has enough OCR in it that it can read those numbers and know where you are. And then it's kind of obvious that such a thing doesn't have to beep. I mean, have you tried this metaphor and explaining it to people? A tag is like this number that a machine can read as you walk by, like a number on you?
I haven't yet, because at this point I'm trying to elicit what people think without pushing them in a particular direction. So that might be the next stage, is then coming up with possible ideas and seeing if people like them. The one thing I will say, though, is that you probably won't have any friends in industry who want to. What I'm seeing right now is they don't even want to mention the terminology RFID to consumers because they think it's too risky, and they don't want to bring up any concept of risk. And so I don't know what will push them towards it, if it's legislation, for example, or what. But at this point, if you try to tell the credit card companies they should even tell you that RFID is in the card, they're going to refuse.
Or you could just say it's like having your credit card number on your shirt.
Which, again, I somehow think they're not going to like that.
All right, I've got two questions. The first is, I'm sort of confused about the technology for the short-range contactless cards. Like, is it possible to read them at a larger distance, or is it like inherently limited to about 5 centimeters or so?
It's theoretically possible. It depends on how much power you can give to an antenna, and so can you do that remotely? I mean, not remotely, but on foot, for example, walking around a public place. Probably hard, because I don't know the amount of equipment you'd have to bring with you in order to power an antenna on that level. Easier to do if you can set up an antenna somewhere in a static place and do line of sight towards somebody. Or even better, it's easier, I think, not just to necessarily read the card, but eavesdrop on the communication between a card and a reader from a longer distance. But again, it's dependent on how much power you can give to an antenna. And I don't think it's limited by the ISO spec there. ISO 14443, and if we have any electrical engineers, they might be able to tell us specifically. But if I recall, it gives you recommended read range, but I don't think it's absolute. So again, it depends on how much power you can give to an antenna, I believe.
All right, and my other question was, what are the advantages of the e-passport for the government?
Oh, advantages? Mm-hmm. The key thing they were looking for was to be able to have a digital photo so that they could do a match between the photo printed on the passport and the one stored on the chip. That's kind of the first level thing they were looking for, as well as to raise the bar in terms of, like we discussed earlier, in terms of being able to counterfeit. Obviously makes it more difficult to counterfeit. But there has definitely been hope expressed that you can then store other things on it in the future, such as iris scan information, fingerprints, and I'm not being paranoid, like this truly is part of the discussion. And also there was talk about using read-write chips so that you could use electronic visas. I don't know where that stands, because I have a feeling that was one of those discussions that happened before people said, maybe there are some security risks with that idea. But so from the government's point of view, it's document security, and it's being able to have one more level in terms of, for the US government at least, looking to make sure that you match the person who's on your passport.
We have another online question. It says, your research focuses on user perception of RFID risk. Mm-hmm. How do you expect your work will eventually be translated into effective change, such as widespread public objection to weakly encrypted RFID, or pressure on government bodies to impose proper technical requirements for ensuring privacy in RFID?
Such a good question. I'm learning actually from participating on this California panel that I'm on that crafting effective public policy is a very difficult thing to do. So I don't really have a soundbite answer for that right now. I would say that it's hard, and I'm just hoping at this point to at least begin the conversation and put a stake in the ground so we can maybe begin that process, but I think it's going to be a long one.
Okay, I think we actually don't have time for any more questions, but if you want to ask anything of Jennifer, you can probably stay afterwards. I just want to thank you again for speaking. Let's give her a nice final round of applause.
Thanks everybody.